My name is Dave Rooney. I'm the Strategic Industry Advisor for the Center for Economic Growth, the leading regional economic development organization in New York's capital region. And we're delighted to host today's webinar focused on the exciting opportunities and the development of the offshore wind industry along the east coast of the US, especially New York State and the state as its epicenter. We at CEG are joined for this webinar today by representatives from NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research and Development Authority, who is the primary driver for New York State in the solicitation and development of offshore wind resources for the state. You'll be hearing shortly from NYSERDA Principal Engineer Adrienne Downey, who I'm sure is familiar to many of the participants in the webinar today. Adrienne will be speaking about the state's plans, NYSERDA's plans, with an overview of the programs and the objectives in spurring offshore wind development here in New York. We're also joined today by representatives from Ørsted and from Eversource. Ørsted, of course, is one of the largest offshore wind developers in the world and a winner in round one of the New York solicitations that were awarded last year. We'll be hearing a comprehensive presentation from Ørsted, Jennifer Garvey, Grant Van Wyngaarden, and from Sam Eaton at Eversource. And we'll hear about their plans for their project and their plans to engage New York businesses and our workforce in the manufacture and assembly and construction of their projects going forward. So that should be, we think, a robust presentation and hopefully spur some conversation at the end of our presentations about the industry and direction that we're headed in. We've got nearly 70 participants or more who've already registered for this webinar, so we're excited to get your feedback. Those folks are from the capital region here where CEG is located, but also from around the country and around the world who are involved in offshore wind itself. So we're happy to have you all join us. I just want to take a minute and talk a bit about the Center for Economic Growth and the capital region. You know, while we're some 100 miles from the New York Harbor, our region boasts what we think are very impressive natural and business attributes and assets that are critical to the potential growth of the offshore wind industry here in New York and on the East Coast. We've got impressive port facilities that many of you are well familiar with at Queens and at the Port of Albany, and also a port under development in East Greenbush right across the river. We've got a highly skilled workforce familiar with manufacturing and technology innovation. We've got a host of colleges and universities, from leading research universities like Rensselaer Polytechnic down to Hudson Valley Community College, where they've got very specific hands-on programs that will help train workforce, not just for manufacturing, but also for assembly, construction, and other attributes and elements of the industry. We've got a strong legacy and roster of manufacturers here in the region that we think are prepared and working to support this industry's growth. And we've engaged with many of you. CEG has engaged with many of you over the last 2 years as we've worked to make folks aware of this region's strengths and of the opportunity that is resident here for the industry to grow in New York, and particularly here in the capital region. We've talked to many of you as industry reps, as government leaders, labor groups, colleges and universities, local manufacturers. We all think there's an opportunity to participate in this, what we think is unprecedented new industry coming to the United States and in particular to New York. We're excited to hear from our participants as well as our presenters, and we're really excited about really exploring the potential for this game-changing industry here in the US. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and our colleague Adrienne Downey from NYSERDA, who's going to outline their efforts to date and talk about why offshore wind in particular is a critical part of New York's energy plans going forward. Hi, Adrienne.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for the invitation to join. You'll note a slight deviation from the program. I'm here masquerading as Matt Vestal, so thank you for indulging our switch here at the end, but we are delighted to join the CEG team, so many thanks, David, for the invitation. Likewise, Peter and Andrea for helping to organize today's webinar. We're glad to have an opportunity to connect with the center's members and hope that today's discussion, offers some helpful insights into what is, as you note, David, very much a game-changing new industry here for New York. So bear with me. I'm going to share my screen.
Great.
And we'll get my slides up and rolling here. Okay. Does that look good, Andrea?
It looks good from here, Adrienne.
Great, thank you, David. I appreciate the confirmation. Just want to make sure. Okay, very good. So today, what I will hope to do is to offer, an introduction to offshore wind on behalf of NYSERDA. So again, my name is Adrienne Downey. I'm the principal engineer for offshore wind with NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. A bit of a mouthful, but NYSERDA serves as the leading authority who is helping to coordinate the offshore wind industry on behalf of New York State's many agencies. So we work very collectively as a state in pursuit of this incredibly powerful initiative and opportunity. So again, we're very pleased to be here speaking to the CEG team and members in order to offer what is hopefully, for those of you who are completely unfamiliar with this technology, an introduction, and then for those of you who are perhaps a little bit further along in your understanding, will serve as the basis maybe for some new information regarding our program. So without further ado, offshore wind in New York State is a big deal. We have a goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. That is a goal that is actually a legal mandate pursuant to New York's nation-leading climate law that was enacted last summer, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. Under the CLCPA, as it's so referred to, we will be working statewide to decarbonize our electricity grid. So meaning that by 2040, we are legislatively required to have 100% clean electricity on our grid. That is an incredibly ambitious goal for a state. And a big part of how we get there is, in utilizing certainly all of the onshore resources, of renewable energy resources that we've been working as a state to evolve over the past number of years, but also increasingly focused on adding offshore wind into the mix. And so the CLCPA enshrines a 9,000 megawatt target by 2035, such that the projects are online and running to satisfy our 2040 goals. And what does that mean? 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind is roughly enough to power 6 million homes. It represents billions of dollars of infrastructure, both private as well as enabling public expenditures in new infrastructure that will support our grids, robustness, reliability, and resiliency. And likewise, 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035 will service an approximate equivalent of 30% of New York State's electricity load. So it really is a major pillar of our goals under the CLCPA. And we're doing so in a fashion that really seeks to take advantage and the full benefit of what is an industry that has been evolving for around 30 years. And we'll be hearing later in the session, as David pointed out, from certainly the global leader in offshore wind development, Ørsted, in partnership with Eversource, a leading New England and Northeastern utility. They're bringing tremendous expertise together with our other project with Empire Wind, and we'll get into that in a moment. But it's really 30 years of experience in Europe and in global markets. That means that the turbines have evolved already substantially over time, and we are in a position now as a state to avail ourselves of tremendous 21st century technology, robust turbines that are pushing 12, 13, 14 megawatts. And as you can see here in this slide, turbine sizes and heights that dwarf, the onshore equivalents. And so with this scale, we also get the benefits certainly of efficiencies and economy of scale. So that's an important part of, when we as a state are looking at our electricity supply mix, our commitment is to the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind. And again, that scale and efficiency that we are able to avail ourselves of is a significant part of where we've decided to go big with this resource. We've also decided to go big with this resource for the obvious benefits that will be delivered as a result to New York State. First and foremost, of course, carbon reduction. Climate change is a major preoccupation of our state and of our globe. It is important that we are doing everything we can from a mitigative perspective to reduce our carbon footprint as quickly as possible. So carbon reduction is certainly a cornerstone of the offshore wind program and aim. But it's also about, again, revitalizing our infrastructure, providing, the critical infrastructure for a 21st century economy is electricity based. And so we are going to be bringing, significant investments in that area. Air quality and health. This is an incredibly important aspect of what offshore wind will specifically bring to our state. Many of the existing carbon-based and fossil fuel fleet that we have on our state currently operating is in the downstate area, and it's particularly a problem as far as environmental justice issues are concerned. The air quality of our cities and of our downstate grid, and offshore wind will offer a really unique opportunity to tackle that problem head on. So we're excited about that prospect and the ability to offer those benefits to those New Yorkers that certainly need air quality improvement the most. Likewise, workforce development and opportunities. And of course, that's going to be a big part of the subject of this discussion here today is, what does this mean for our supply chain? What does this mean for critical port infrastructure? And what does this mean for workforce development? Again, at the outset, we said that 9 gigawatts of offshore wind is anticipated to bring the better part of 10,000 jobs alongside it. And David, you very aptly pointed out that the capital region is poised to play a major role in helping to deliver those investments and to cultivate a strong workforce that can participate in this endeavor. So New York State's work in offshore wind development, just to give you a little bit of context as far as NYSERDA's role and my role with the group, is certainly to develop energy policy and strategy. We engage with stakeholders, such as what we're doing here today, and we are helping to cultivate opportunities to maximize supply chain development and workforce development and training. We engage on very significant research and data development, whether that's mid-ocean data that we're accumulating in the Bight offshore, or whether it's monitoring of critical species and environmental data. We also cultivate significant data as far as workforce development opportunities are concerned. And so we make sure that everything that we do, especially on a policy and strategy perspective, is well founded by research and science fundamentally. And we also then cultivate, in pulling all of these threads together, perhaps what we're most known for by some is our work as the buyer in long-term revenue contracts with the projects. And we'll get into that in a moment. But indeed, NYSERDA offers long-term financial agreements related to the purchase of environmental attributes that ultimately enables these contracts to move forward. So speaking of which, last summer, in tandem with the signing of the CLCPA, our nation's most aggressive climate legislation, we also made the largest single procurement announcement in the nation. We announced our commitment to 2 projects, to the Sunrise Wind Project that we're going to be hearing from, but also to the Empire Wind Project, which is 816 megawatts located centrally in the New York Bight. This single announcement was enough to power over half of all of New York City households, just to give you a sense of scale. And so again, we're really moving the needle and trying to do so with all due urgency as we pursue these projects. And so we were very pleased to make that announcement last summer. But it complements an initiative already underway by our colleagues with the Long Island Power Authority, LIPA, as administered by CEG, who have the South Fork project underway. And that is also another project that this team that you're going to be hearing from later today can speak to. So the South Fork Wind Project is 130 megawatts, and you can see that to the northeastern most of the three areas that are indicated. That project is a little bit ahead of the NYSERDA contracts and is steadily moving forward throughout its permitting and approvals processes. The Sunrise Wind Project just south is again the team that we're going to be hearing from later today with 880 megawatts as Sunrise Wind. And then again, as indicated, the third project that New York broadly is working on is the Empire Wind Project, which is being developed by Equinor Wind. So each of these projects, together accumulate to around 1,800 megawatts of offshore wind under developed, which is tremendous progress to our date, but we still have a lot to do before we get to 9 gigawatts. And we're joined increasingly through the region. So if you've been following offshore wind, you remember that first we started with Block Island Wind Farm, which is off the coast of Rhode Island. And what is a 30 megawatt project has now become a 26 gigawatt regional industry. So when we look up and down the coast from effectively Maine through the Carolinas, there's tremendous appetite. New York has been joined by Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, all with major targets. Virginia likewise, all with major targets that it really puts, I think, the offshore wind industry squarely on the map for not only New York's purposes, but as a global concern. So this is a global industry, and we are, with this regional aggregated capacity, really attracting global attention and opportunity. We see it as, pardon the pun, but the rising tide that floats all boats. It's a tremendous opportunity for New York, certainly, but it is also a tremendous opportunity for our neighboring states, and we appreciate the aggregated potential that will offer certainly significant projects, but also stability longer term to the supply chain that we are all hoping to cultivate. So I think it's interesting, though, when you look briefly at this map, we see New York poised very centrally in the midst of the highest concentration of active lease sites. We found in our first procurement that our competitive reach is actually as far afield as the northeasternmost or the outermost Vineyard Wind lease, all the way through to the southern tier of New Jersey. Those are the projects that we can competitively reach as the state, and it also means that as we pursue our target, and we are offering repeat solicitations, that we are able to offer, I think, a very robust competitive market, but we are able also to offer a depth of market and a longevity of market that is certainly very important to cultivating a long-term presence from a new industry. And so it's with that in mind that we look to the next steps for development of these projects. This is just a schematic to help understand, what does it mean to have made an award? Well, it means that the process, the projects have now, the financial instruments and the various revenues in hand to be able to understand, or the security rather for future revenues in hand to be able to understand, how they can construct their project. They have a tremendous amount of work underway as far as permitting and approvals that they can now initiate in full earnest. And so between 2019 and 2023, these projects are anticipated to be continuing that process, securing the requisite approvals, both offshore from the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management specifically, who are tasked with permitting and approvals for all of the asset areas greater than 3 nautical miles offshore, and then likewise on-state approvals for the onshore infrastructure portions of the project. The projects will also be working steadily during that time and concurrently on developing their plans for supply chain cultivation, on working with local partners, as well as potentially seeding investments from international partners in order to cultivate manufacturing during that time, such that between 2022 and 2024, the projects can be working on construction and installation in earnest and commission by 2024. And so all of this may feel like it's sort of farther out and further afield, but it's really in infrastructure terms tomorrow. So I'm sure we'll be hearing from the Sunrise team that they are working very diligently and in earnest on these projects, but hopefully that offers some indication of timelines and how the sequencing will move. And then once those projects are commissioned, then we will have contract lives with them for 25 years. We'll be again purchasing the financial, the environmental attributes associated with these projects in a product known as an offshore wind renewable energy credit, or OREC. And so just to round things out, and I hope I'm doing all right for time, David, please let me know if not, but we just wanted to conclude here by offering a little bit of a 101 to say, what is an offshore wind turbine? And again, for those who are familiar, apologies, but for those who are not, we hope that it's helpful in orienting you. Effectively, offshore wind projects are a combination of offshore infrastructure and onshore infrastructure. The offshore infrastructure constitutes of wind turbines that are being installed on foundations in the ocean, in areas that are designated by the federal government, and again, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. There's an offshore substation, which is part of the electrical infrastructure offshore. And then fundamentally, these projects are connected via underwater cables to substations onshore. And here you see the array cables as a schematic thereof. And then onshore, the projects will bring their power ultimately to the grid, make cable landfall using usually conventional technology such as horizontal directional drilling to bring a cable ashore. And then in order to do all of these various activities, this is where we start to see, the interplay between, oftentimes offshore wind projects and port discussions go hand in hand, and we start to see why. To do all of these pieces of, or to install each of these pieces of infrastructure, requires a diversity of vessels, as well as marshaling and equipment supply, so as to be able to deliver components to the offshore farms and to facilitate their installation. And so when we talk about the ecosystem, it's important to recognize that we're going to be hearing from an offshore wind developer, but the ecosystem that is enabled by our contracts with Ørsted and with Eversource as the Sunrise Wind team, or with Equinor, or with future offshore wind developers as we complete successive procurements over the next coming years towards our 9 gigawatt goal, is going to cultivate, what is really an ecosystem of opportunity. So the developers work very closely with their core project development team to support engagements with component manufacturing entities, which include OEMs or turbine manufacturers. So OEMs meaning original equipment manufacturers. Those are the Siemens, Gamesas of the world, the GEs of the world, the MHI Vestas and others, as well as top tier suppliers who engage with foundation design, for example. Each of those companies will have their own ecosystem of raw materials, parts, and supply that are commonly referred to in the industry as tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. And so we start to see, just the breadth of one single project and maybe one single developer may ultimately yield literally thousands and thousands of supply contracts underneath it. And so, as we're moving towards execution of these projects, the first phase, again, will be focused on, engineering, permitting studies, and planning of the project. Following very closely thereafterwards will be, certainly engagements with the OEMs in order to support, again, those subcomponents that comprise the turbine and the foundations. And then thereafterwards, again, each of those OEMs and tier ones will engage with the industry in order to cultivate all manner of raw materials and supply. And that, I think, is important to recognize that the first two tiers are really involved heavily in the design, installation, construction, and commissioning phases of a project. But the raw materials, parts, and supply, that those 2-3 tier suppliers, really are in it for life. There's an operations and maintenance component to these projects that is substantial. And so all of these supply opportunities, really are not just sort of the infrastructure peak of construction, but really for the long haul as these projects are continuing to deliver power to New York State for the next 25 years, excuse me. So I think with that wraps it up from my side, but I understand, David and Peter, that we're going to defer questions for now, encouraging folks to, if you do have questions, to put them into the Q&A function, and that we'll reserve those toward the end of the presentation. But certainly, we'd be happy to, either today or at some future point in time, please do take note of these communication channels, and we'd be happy to engage with you then. Thank you.
Great, Adrienne. Thank you so much. And now I think we'll pivot over and hear from our team from Ørsted and Eversource. Jennifer, Grant, and Sam, if you want to take it from here, and it's all yours.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Garvey. I am the New York Market Affairs Manager for Ørsted. And I thank you for that fine introduction, Adrienne, thorough and excellent as always. And thank you to everyone at the CEG for inviting us to participate in this opportunity. It's terrific to have this time on a beautiful Thursday afternoon to connect with so many of you in the Capital Region. And we look forward, of course, to doing this in person one day soon, but certainly a fun way to get started. I'm going to start with just a sort of an introduction to Ørsted, to our projects. I'll be joined by my colleague Sam Eaton, and then we'll do a little deeper dive into the supply chain opportunities together with our head of U.S. procurement, Grant Van Wyngaarden. But let me just start by saying that from a developer's perspective, New York really has created an extraordinary opportunity by taking such a strong stance on the transition to renewable energy generally, and specifically by setting such a clear and ambitious goal for offshore wind. 9 gigawatts by 2035 does make New York State the largest market in the nation, and that's obviously something that catches the developer's interest. I think it positions New York really well to get as much of the supply chain pie as it possibly can. It certainly gives us as developers a great deal of confidence that this is a place to set down roots, to make major investments. And so we look forward. We are delighted to have the projects that we do here in New York. Delighted to be a part of this groundbreaking opportunity, trailblazing opportunity, and we hope that this is the first conversation of many as we look forward to this new industry evolving here in New York State. New York certainly is an extraordinary state by many measures. I think that obviously because of Long Island's sort of unique position as the tip of the spear with respect to its location relative to where offshore wind turbines were located, it has sort of it will have a different role as a place where an offshore wind sort of plugs into the local grid. But the Capital Region with its port facilities are really a terrific fit for offshore wind, and together with the area's rich history and industry, the extraordinary knowledge economy that exists here, we have a lot to talk about, and so we're again delighted to be starting this conversation and look forward to spending lots of time with all of you. I'll just give you a bit of background about Ørsted as a company. As was mentioned, Ørsted. Thank you for the slide change, Grant. Ørsted is, or Ørsted, as they say in Denmark, is of course a Danish company and a renewable energy company that is the global leader in offshore wind. Ørsted effectively invented offshore wind back in 1991. It was the first company to locate turbines in the water off the coast of Denmark. And obviously since then, they've really not looked back. Today, Ørsted has built and now operates well over 1,000 offshore wind turbines. That's about 25% of all of the offshore wind that's currently in operation today around the globe. Here in the United States, obviously this is a new industry, but Ørsted does own and operate the Block Island Wind Farm, which is the first project in the nation, 5 turbines located right off the coast of Block Island. Just recently, actually in the last couple of weeks, actually, we've added to the number of turbines in operation today here in the United States, or they're coming online rather, with a little project that we have off of Virginia, and that's actually the first project to be built in federal waters. And in general, we have about 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind under contract in the United States. You know, I'll also say that our company story is really quite interesting. Ørsted was previously an oil and natural gas company that over the past decade has made a commitment to transition to renewable energy. And it's really been a tremendous success story. Our formal company vision is to create a world that runs entirely on green energy. And earlier this year, we're actually named the most sustainable company in the world, if you can believe that. Really an exciting designation. So I will say a big part of our success, though, is that we pick great partners. And for our New York projects and some of our other projects in the Northeast portfolio, our partner is Eversource. And so with that, I will hand it over to Sam Eaton to tell you a bit about Eversource and the projects that we have going on here in New York.
Great, thanks, Jen, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here today. And like Jen said, hope we can all be out together sometime soon. Just wanted to say thank you again also to CEG as well as NYSERDA for their leadership around offshore wind. It certainly has been tremendous to see the level of support that the state really has brought to the offshore wind industry, and it really positioned itself as a leader to help develop offshore wind going forward. For those of you that don't know us at Eversource, we really are a new name on a very long legacy that has existed in the Northeast and New England for more than 100 years. We were formed by the merger of Northeast Utilities and Instar Company back in 2013. At that time, both of those predecessor companies have roots that go all the way back to the days of Thomas Edison and really shaped the electrification of New England. Today, we've got more than 8,000 employees that live and work in the communities that we serve in the Northeast and New England. And we've really just seen tremendous growth. At the time we merged to create Eversource, we were the 17th largest utility in the nation. Today, through market cap, we're one of the top 10 companies in the nation. I'm very happy to see that growth. But part of that growth has really been driven by the opportunity to be a partner with the states in which we work. Back 15, 20 years ago, that was driven by a need to really bring prices down in the Northeast. We were a partner in the states helping to build $6 to $8 billion worth of transmission in order to reduce congestion charges in the region and make it more affordable to both live and do business in New England. Today, we're transforming into a company that has really positioned itself to be the catalyst for clean energy and decarbonization in New England in response to many of the types of objectives that Adrienne mentioned earlier in this discussion. With that, we've obviously broken new ground with Ørsted, setting up one of the first partnerships and relationships to get offshore wind going here in North America, but also have set an industry-leading goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. We're also the #1 energy efficiency provider in the US, and we've been that way for more than 8 years now. I'm very proud to continue that honor as we go forward. In addition to that, we continue to invest and develop new solutions around electric vehicles, utility scale solar programs, and some industry-leading storage programs that have been launched here recently at Eversource. All very exciting as we continue to grow and see the clean energy sector really develop as we try to solve the global problem around climate change. We can flip to the next slide here. So with that, we've introduced the two companies. Wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about who we are as a partnership. It is a little bit unique, I'm sure, that when folks hear about the project Sunrise Wind in South Fork, as well as our project elsewhere in the Northeast, Revolution Wind, and hopefully future projects to hear both companies mentioned. We are a joint venture. It's a 50-50 operating partnership. Unlike so many other relationships you see in the Ørsted portfolio, it means that both parties are at the table for all discussions as we move forward, and it really leverages the experience that both of us bring to the table. As Jen mentioned earlier in the discussion, Ørsted's global leadership around offshore wind, having invented this industry 20 years ago, and Eversource's leading development platform for energy infrastructure here in the Northeast. We are today focused on that relationship. We started it back in 2016 with a very narrow mandate to really get the industry off the ground. At that point, there was awarded one project, the Block Island Wind Farm, which was just coming online. And there were two projects that were in the formation at that point, South Fork Wind, which we're very excited to be partners with Ørsted on today, as well as a project down in Maryland. There were some small procurement mandates that were out there, around 1,600 megawatts or so in Massachusetts, a few other smaller mandates in Rhode Island and a couple of the other states, as well as the LIPA project that had been put out there. Today, we've seen more than tenfold growth in just a short period of about 4 or 5 years in the industry. And with that growth has really been the growth of our relationship with Ørsted. We've been able to collectively form the largest developer of offshore wind development, offshore wind development assets in North America. When we couple that with not only our joint assets, but also Ørsted's individually owned assets in the Mid-Atlantic region, we really do have a tremendous portfolio. Here in the Northeast, that means we have more than 4,000 megawatts of development capacity available for these projects. In addition, we're looking at building more than 1,700 megawatts of awarded contracts, placing us, as I mentioned, as the largest developer currently in the US. We're very excited for that opportunity. If we can move on to the next slide here. So I wanted to touch on just each of our projects. As we think about South Fork Wind in particular, this one is really a pioneering project for New York. It's a smaller project of about 130 megawatts, but it was the first project to be awarded in New York. It's going to be New York's first wind farm to come online. It's going to also be the largest source of clean energy on Long Island for a time being until our later project, Sunrise Wind, comes on board. If we look forward into the rest of the slide here, just to touch on it, it is 130 megawatts coming into East Hampton substation. It will come ashore there on the beach through an HDD. Very minimal impact to the local community. We've done everything possible to minimize that impact as we look forward. And it's going to sell its power to the Long Island Power Authority and PSE&G as its operator out there, and help the town be able to meet its sustainability commitments for clean energy. In addition, it was awarded through an RFP process that LIPA ran back in the 2016 timeframe in order to solve a reliability need and avoid the need to construct large new transmission infrastructure in the area. And most importantly, as we think about clean energy and the sustainability message that we've been talking about today, it also avoids the need to run some very aging diesel generators that are located at the East Hampton substation, which will certainly have clean air benefits there locally, not only regionally and globally as we think about climate change. Most importantly, its size gives it the power for approximately 70,000 homes out there on the South Fork of Long Island, which we're excited to be able to bring to scale. If we go ahead and move forward to Sunrise, if we get excited about South Fork, Sunrise is a project that we truly just get enamored with, given its size. It's the largest project that we have in our portfolio. It's also the second largest project that's been awarded in the US. Just like South Fork, it'll be located over the horizon, so you shouldn't be able to see anything even out from Montauk when you go to the beaches. It'll be delivered into Brookhaven, New York via an HDD there at the shoreline on Smith Point Beach. And we've been in a very close partnership with the community of Brookhaven as we've been developing this project in order to make sure that many of those benefits that Adrienne mentioned earlier in the discussion will be able to accrue to the local community. And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. As we think about the relationship with Brookhaven and the opportunity that it presents, it's also a situation where this will be an economic development engine for the region. We'll have many new jobs that are coming out, over 800 direct jobs that are expected by the project, 1,500 to 2,000 indirect jobs that we expect for it. In addition, we've also committed to a project labor agreement and paying prevailing wages as part of the project. So all significant benefits that we fully expect will be accruing, and it's to that point of why offshore wind makes so much sense for a state like New York. Not only is it bringing clean energy and sustainability to the state, but it's also bringing the economic development and the job opportunities to help the state pay for the cost of offshore wind. As mentioned, at 880 megawatts, it's also power for about 500,000 customers, which will be a sizable chunk of the numbers that Adrienne mentioned early in the discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen, and she's going to take you through a few of the very exciting opportunities that we have for the Brookhaven community coming out of the Sunrise Project and where we are with the development of those.
Great, thanks, Sam. So as Sam mentioned, we're literally, through our Sunrise Project, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in New York State, you know, as part of this, the development of this project. And, you know, this is where we talk about, you know, creating opportunities and making investments that will have, you know, we hope will have lasting impact in different regions. And so to be more specific about that, we've committed to a $10 million commitment to fund a national workforce training center that will be located on Long Island in Suffolk County. You know, this is envisioned as a partnership between labor, environmental organizations, and hosted by the Suffolk County Community College, who will serve as the academic anchor for this establishment. We envision a creation of unique facilities that will support all of these partners and just facilitate their entry and participation into the offshore wind industry, and generally grow the knowledge economy in the area with respect to offshore wind. In addition to that, we've also committed to a $1 million Upper Hudson Workforce Development Fund. And that really is intended to support a major initiative that we've committed to, which you'll see here on the second slide if you just want to flip to the next slide, Grant. But in connection, this is a training fund that will support the fabrication of the secondary steel components in the capital region. So this is where certainly where the CEG comes into play, and opportunities for the capital region more broadly. But there's a major component of our projects related to the construction of foundation components that will take place in the capital region. And this is a fund that is meant to ensure that we have the skilled labor available to make that work, to make sure we can take advantage of workers in the region, and generally to facilitate the success of that commitment. Additionally, we've committed $10 million to New York Port's infrastructure development. That's still a number that's in play in terms of where we'll be dedicated to, and something that we're actively working on. And finally, we have a commitment to locating our operations and maintenance hub in the Port Jefferson community, which is located on Long Island. All of our wind farms, or wind farms in general, are serviced by technicians who spend obviously a great deal of time out at the wind farm, and understanding that these wind farms are built quite a distance from shore, 35 miles from Montauk, was the reference that was just made. The standard way to approach this is to have a vessel, actually a very large vessel, like a hotel boat. It's called a surface operation vessel, and that's where our technicians will stay, will live. They'll be at work for 2 weeks at a time, living in the wind farm and going to the turbines every day to perform their regular maintenance. There's also obviously a crew that supports the operation of that vessel, but that vessel will call Port Jefferson home. So when it comes to port once or twice a month, it will come into the community of Port Jefferson. But this is a commitment certainly to New York. Those are jobs that will emanate from the Port Jefferson area, but certainly available to folks who live throughout New York State who might be interested in living on the water for a couple of weeks at a time. We have some really great videos about what it's like to be a turbine mechanic. It's an interesting life. And I will say too, just with respect to the fabrication of these major components in the capital region. That just as someone who's I'm a New Yorker, obviously. I've lived here my entire life, and getting to just speaking with my colleagues from Europe, who've been a part of this industry for so long. It's really interesting to hear as we go to visit sites and they talk about a similar experience years, not so long ago, frankly, where they were visiting sites and scoping out locations for major investments by Ørsted, and it's through its, as part of its supply chain, and what those locations are today. Just big humming locations with filled with offshore wind support components, and just what a dramatic impact it can have on an area. We're really excited to be to be a part of this. So next slide, please. So obviously, offshore wind is, and so much of this is about, respecting the ocean and learning to coexist with other maritime users, the fishing community in particular, and obviously taking great care with the resource that we will be working within. And so a commitment to the fishing community and the environmental community is a core focus of all of our work. The fishing community certainly is as near and dear to us here. I'm here on Long Island today, near and dear to us here in New York, in this downstate area and throughout the New England area. And I will say we have a great commitment to scientific research to make sure that we understand all of the impacts associated with offshore wind in the marine environment. The Block Island installation really was a research project in many respects. Obviously, this has been done successfully in Europe for many years, and research has shown that offshore wind and nature are doing really well together. But we're in a different environment here in the United States, and the water's off of the Northeast, and so we spend a great deal of time understanding the marine resources that we'll be working in. And with respect to Block Island, we did quite a bit of research to understand, what the location was like before construction started, with a baseline study that began 2 years in advance of the project. There were signs that continued through the construction phase and for the 2 years following construction to really understand what, if any, impacts had occurred as a result of the construction and operation of the wind farm. And the good news is that it has shown really that fishing is at least as good as it was before construction as it is after. So it's really been, it's been a great success story, but we fully intend to continue that commitment to science and just adding to our understanding of how we can best coexist with our fellow maritime users and the marine life here in the Northeast. Okay, with that, Grant, we'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Jen. I have the pleasure of speaking about the supply chain of building a wind farm, offshore wind farm, and the opportunities in the capital region that will come from that through the Sunrise Wind project at first and the other projects that are coming to our shores. First off, a little bit about myself. I'm part of the U.S. procurement team within Ørsted, part of the supply chain development team, which is to deliver on Ørsted's vision of having a self-sustaining U.S. supply chain for our future offshore wind farms. And that certainly is starting with the wind farms that we have in our portfolio today. Front and center are South Fork and Sunrise. And I'd have to say that the heat recovery steam generator that sailed down the Hudson in 2017 certainly showed to the world that the capital region is capable of building large energy projects, and certainly caught the attention of offshore development and what's possible for large energy components to be manufactured or assembled in the capital region. and brought down the Hudson. So certainly there are some exciting opportunities for the capital region, and we fully foresee that for the Sunrise Wind Farm. Specifically, I'd say when we are looking at building an offshore wind farm, there are a lot of major components, and I would say that Adrienne did an excellent job with the overview of all the major components that go into an offshore wind farm. And if anyone is interested in learning more, the NYSERDA website does have an Offshore Wind 101 that I recommend. It covers a lot of the information that she had provided, and certainly some of the stuff that I could talk to here. But for the purpose of this conversation, I really want to highlight the, on the left-hand side here, you see the WTG, or the wind turbine generator. Those are the major components that attract a lot of the attention for an offshore wind farm, and those comprise of the blades, the nacelles, and the towers. And for the capital region to be excited for the components that the turbines sit on, at least initially for the Sunrise Wind Farm, until we start with some announcements of major component manufacturing facilities being set up. Until then, and certainly as part of the Sunrise Wind commitments, we have substantial plans for components related to the foundations, and I'll speak to them to a specific slide coming up. In addition to that, of course, all the onshore works, certainly with our existing New York offshore wind farms, we're looking at cable laying and substations on Long Island, which will present a huge opportunity for New York companies. And specifically in terms of the capital region, there could be some great opportunities related to either electrical components, structural steel, concrete, and other elements that go into building those significant structures that are certainly important for the wind farm. With Sunrise, we are currently in the development phase. So this is the full life cycle. And I think it's important when we're looking at an offshore wind farm from a supply chain view to understand these distinct phases. The majority of money that's spent by the developers happens in development and in CapEx. And then the longest duration time is, of course, during operations and maintenance, or as we would call it, our operational expenditures. So here within the development phase, what we're doing is a lot of design and engineering, permitting works, of course, securing legal and financial services to get ready for when we start CapEx. Interesting, we are now engaging in site investigations to understand the resources where our assets will be deployed. A few weekends ago, I was on a bike ride and went to Smith Point Beach and happened to see one of the vessels offshore doing some of the site investigations work there, getting ready for the works that are to come. Also in this development phase, we are looking to secure contracts for the long lead items. So these are the major components that, as you can imagine, for the volume of these projects require a lot of manufacturing and production time. And so in this phase, there will be announcements for contracts awarded for the turbines, the foundations, the cables, and then the major electrical equipment that go with that. In addition to the major installations works, there are only a few vessels available worldwide to do some of these heavy lifts. And so securing those early is critical for the successful construction of a wind farm. Once a wind farm is completed, we'll have a substantial amount of opportunities for businesses in the O&M realm, and primarily that will be out of our Port Jefferson hub that Jen spoke to earlier. For the onshore substations themselves, for Sunrise, we have that position from cable landing at Smith Point and onshore substation near Holbrook, which is exciting for me because it's almost in my backyard, but also because it's going to be a great opportunity for New Yorkers. There's a substantial amount of civil construction that goes into that in addition to concrete and structural steel for these buildings. And of course, a substantial amount of electrical works. For the capital region specifically, there's potential for components and materials to go towards the construction of these. But I think for today's purpose, I really want to get everyone excited about the AFC, or Advanced Foundation Components, which many on the webinar today might know this as secondary steel. So these are core components to our foundations, and the capital region is well positioned to help us with the manufacturing and supply of these major components. Three of them there are in the top left of the screen. The first is the external concrete platform, and this is the platform that technicians can climb up to or hoist it up to have access to the wind farm. It's a very large concrete and steel structure, can weigh anywhere from 100 to 150 tons, and is 40 to 50 feet in diameter. Below that, we have the anode cage, which is sacrificial steel to help with cathodic protection or corrosion. And it also attaches onto the monopile foundation and is a rather large structure. And then to the right, actually all of these pictures don't do these components justice, because the suspended internal platform, for example, is much larger than as pictured. It's several stories. I think it's actually 30 feet tall and can be as wide as 20 feet. And these components provide access for technicians to move in and around the internal portion of the foundation and turbine, and also houses a lot of the major electrical components and wiring, and are quite complex structures in themselves. With the supply of these items, there's a substantial amount of work that goes into each of them, and the most common, as you can imagine, would be metalworking, welding, fastening. Of course, for any onshore works, for preparation of logistics and transportation, riggers are required, crane operators, stevedores, and then an abundance of additional workers to just fabricating or assembling these very large components. There's also, for any of the sites that would be set up for the production of these items, there would be indirect scopes that would be included, such as site security, facilities management, project management, etc. Before I get into Q&A, which, just as a reminder, if you do have questions, feel free to enter those into the chat, and we'll be able to start to go through those as they're coming in, but we have the opportunity to enter those in now. Just before we get into that, I'd like to highlight some of the opportunities for how to get involved. The first, I would say, is the Sunrise Wind project has its website, sunrisewindny.com. And on that, if you scroll down on the right-hand side, you'll see links to both Ørsted's and Eversource's global supply chain registries. Our joint teams, procurement teams, utilize those lists for identifying suppliers when they're building their tender invite lists, and especially for the Ørsted folks that have a large procurement team in Europe, as they're looking to engage with New York suppliers that we haven't perhaps worked with or procured scopes from in the past, we rely on these lists to identify those companies. But we also, especially for our New York projects, rely on the NYSERDA supply chain registry, which I can tell already that many of the folks on today's webinar are already signed up, which is excellent. And some of those through that registration have been contacted by the Sunrise Wind Project procurement teams, or from our tier 1 suppliers who may already be invited to a particular tender. And so if you're not, or if you haven't registered on that website, I highly encourage that you do. Similarly, if your company is a New York certified women or minority owned business, there is the ESD or Empire State Development Division of Minority and Women's Business Development that organizes the list here on that URL that we look at and look through to identify additional suppliers specifically with the women and minority business communities. And then lastly, for potential opportunities beyond just New York, there is a substantial offshore wind industry happening in the US with an estimated $70 billion of CapEx to be spent based on the laws that have been written today across the majority of states. There is also the Business Network of Offshore Wind Supply Chain Registry, which is utilized by Ørsted and other developers for projects beyond just New York to identify strong and capable suppliers that can help us deliver these monumental projects. And with that, I will hand the mic back over to CEG to get into Q&A.
Thank you, Grant. Appreciate it. It was very helpful to hear from you and your colleagues about the impressive activities and projects and timelines that you have in place for New York, and the implications of those are I think, obvious to our participants here today. And particularly now with an opportunity to connect directly with you through some of the lists and other approaches that you mentioned. I would also remind folks that on your invitations to participate in the actual in the webinar today, you can link up with us at CEG. We certainly have got some tools and resources, particularly if you're here in the capital region, and obviously strong relationships with Ørsted and Eversource and NYSERDA and many other parties. So happy to engage in that as well. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andrea Swank, who I believe has our first question for us. Andrea, if you're available and can tee up that first question, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely, happy to. So our first question is, with your projects being based down Long Island and Suffolk County, what opportunities are there for a business located upstate in the capital region area?
I can take that one. I would say that certainly with regards to the onshore works that is happening in Long Island, but as we're building the supply chain for offshore wind farms, we're looking at a global supply chain with components coming from all over the world, and through that logistics happening through vessels offshore. And with that, the capital region is a prime area for what we see as manufacturing of the major components that would be delivered either directly to the turbines themselves or to a staging area before being finally installed. And as I mentioned, the heat recovery steam generator, highlighting the capabilities that exist in capital region, that certainly is just one of many examples showcasing what the capital region can deliver and the attractiveness of the region for us and other developers in terms of workforce capability, skills, and just general cost competitiveness for manufacturing those components. So I would say that there is no doubt in my mind a lot of opportunities for the capital regions, and we're currently looking at that for the supply of various components.
Great, thank you. I think there's another question that kind of ties into that. Someone had asked, and it was when we were speaking about the latest project, what the odds are that the capital region would be awarded some of the project and what the timing is of those awards.
Yep, so I can circle back on the secondary steel or AFC. That is a tender that we're currently managing right now. And there is a portion that is looking to be targeted for the capital region, and the contract award for that is looking to be Q4 of this year. So hopefully when we get there, we'll have some exciting announcements to make around opportunities for the capital region, specifically for that tender.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Grant. What type of welding certifications are required for the advanced foundation components?
That is a question that unfortunately I don't know the detail of. Because my role spans across all the major components, unfortunately I don't get to go into the details for each of the various aspects. If there is somebody else on the call that might be, or the webinar, that can provide that answer. If not, I would have to say the tier 1 vendors that we've been engaged with globally, who are currently engaged in tenders that we're managing or will be in the future, have been working in offshore wind in Europe, are fully aware of the certifications that would be required. And as they're looking to engage with subcontractors for welding works, they would provide that information.
I think that's right, Grant. I know that my colleague Peter Lyon with the Center for Economic Growth, as well as Adrienne, and I'm sure some of our other colleagues at NYSERDA, can help share relevant information regarding certifications and other capabilities. And if companies, once that we determine exactly what the certification is, if they don't have those certifications, we at CEG and other partners from throughout the state are working to connect resources that can help provide those certifications up to the specs that are there for you and for your tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. So that's something we recognize is an important capability and program that we need to work to create and make sure it's available to our manufacturers as well as to you guys.
Yeah, I think that's right, David. And I'd like to just jump in and if I may, and offer up that I was remiss in my remarks in speaking to offshore wind workforce development, but the work that the state is doing in terms of workforce development and training. And so, you know, Jen, in your remarks, you know, you spoke about the work that is happening downstate, but if you've been following the news at all as well, you may be cognizant that New York State has made a commitment to invest $20 million specifically in offshore wind training that will be administered through the SUNY system. And that is intended, you know, the legwork for that is ongoing right now. It is actively evolving, but that $20 million is not a specific investment to any one individual institution. Rather, it's what we're doing at the moment is looking statewide and particularly looking at the areas that are of particular interest for offshore wind development, notably the capital region, New York City and Long Island, in order to make an assessment of what the workforce you know, has already to offer. I think that's part of what is so compelling about New York for these projects, is that we have, you know, an incredible workforce that is already available and works on, you know, world-class infrastructure projects. You know, we look at the new Tappan Zee bridge construction and other forms of major infrastructure development. You know, we know that New Yorkers are well poised to be able to do this work. So what is, you know, how do we ensure that any of the gaps, right, or any of the incremental training, you know, that we are able to suss that out, make those assessments, and then make sure that that those training programs are made available in the regions in which they are needed, and also in tandem with the types of work that is specific to each of those regions. And so where we look at the capital region, and I think, Grant, you did a very good job of you know, walking through that. You know, when we look at the capital region, the port infrastructure assets that are located in that region are really extremely compelling to this industry. And the state is also making substantial commitments to support port infrastructure. These first two projects already, you know, have committed private spending of almost $87 million. The state will be committing $200 million in port infrastructure, capital infrastructure improvements over the next, within our next procurement. You know, it's going to be, port infrastructure is everything when we talk about offshore wind. And you know, I heard it once characterized that, you know, you can think about the Hudson River as sort of a floating assembly line for the projects, and I think that's an accurate representation. So it's really going to be about making those assessments for workforce, closing the gaps, and then getting the training out on time and ready to be able to make sure that that New Yorkers are well poised and equipped to be able to participate directly in this workforce and the opportunity that it offers.
Yep. I'll just mention too, a little plug for our that the $1 million that we set aside for our Upper Hudson Workforce Fund, just for the very purpose of making sure that, you know, we would have funds to deploy to support the training as needs may arise. And so that's something that we'll be able to roll out. You know, I think certainly as we once the tender is announced, the result of the tender is announced, you know, that's when the use of that funds really begins to crystallize.
Maybe just add one other piece on here. We've been very focused on kind of the headline components in manufacturing that obviously make up the bulk of our spending. But I think it's also important to think about some of the smaller businesses and the opportunities that are presented by those, both on Long Island, New York City, but also in the capital region. You saw Grant's slide today talking about where the majority of the spend is in that DevX period. And today we're doing a lot of the onshore survey and offshore survey activities that include things like drilling for soil samples and marking control locations for some of our overhead survey activities and wetlands delineation, environmental characterization, things like that, that are making up a number of opportunities for service providers to come in and provide services to this industry. And I know just looking across our supplier database of who's doing work right now, there are a number of folks, not just on Long Island, but back in the city and up in the capital region and across all of the Northeast that are really supporting that work. So don't want to forget those folks.
Yeah,
and that's a very good point. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think that is a good segue to ask Adrienne about the 2018 RFQ that went out and exactly what type of local content New York had included and what could be registered by a developer as they're seeking to identify exactly what they're investing in New York.
Sure, that's a great question, Peter. I appreciate it. So in 2018, you know, we launched our first tender for offshore wind, our first competitive solicitation that concluded, as I indicated, in last summer in 2019 when we announced the awardees. But the process of you know, preparing the bid is very much, you know, well, not only of preparing the bid, but of writing the RFP is a very, you know, important strategic effort for the state. You know, we understand these projects are huge. They represent an incredible opportunity and very important, you know, certainly an important means of enabling our, you know, our climate goals, but also of incorporating you know, a number of really important policy considerations. You know, it's a tremendously large lever to be able to pull. And so we, you know, took that responsibility very seriously. Economic development was top of mind. The projects are not beholden to local content requirements, if you will. They are, however, deeply incentivized to support local content. So there are in our actions as the state authority are governed by you know, the Public Service Commission of the state of New York, and they prescribed to us the ability to evaluate projects based upon 70% price, 20% economic benefits, and 10% viability. So already, you know, in the evaluation phase, that's a very heavy weight, a full 20%, you know, related to spend, and that's how we qualify it. So it's about dollars spent in the state of New York and jobs created in the state of New York for not only the construction phase of the project, but also you know, for the first few years of operation. That is, I think, our primary lever, but also in addition, and I think Sam and Grant, you know, both alluded to this as well, you know, we had requirements that these projects be subject to prevailing wage as a major driver, ensuring that not only are we getting jobs, but we're getting well-paid jobs, good quality jobs, and in many cases careers. We also tucked in, you know, an obligation to engage with labor in order to you know, put forward a project labor agreement, or at least the obligation to engage with labor towards negotiation of a PLA. We think that's an important signal as well to offer to the industry. And so all of these considerations, you know, together help to provide, you know, the initial thrust, but we also tucked in, obligations that these developers, Ørsted and Empire Wind, respectively, would be seeking local content from local parties through what we call the New York supplier opportunity. And so for each as we spoke about the ecosystem of contracts that come from each of these sort of master contracts, if you will, for any individual subcontract that was greater than $5 million, there is an obligation to reach out to the New York business community and to offer an opportunity to compete where is practical to do so. And clearly there are some scope of supply that, being a nascent industry, are not yet available locally. But it's important that we start offering those signals, and we start offering not only the direct opportunity to bid on some of these evolving scopes of work, but also an understanding that this is something that if I invested X, Y, Z, or if I adapted my workforce in such a fashion that I might be able to participate in this industry as well. And so those were the types of provisions that we included as sort of our package of incentives, if you will, and we think it was a pretty strong incentive, and certainly delivered significant results. These first two projects alone will anticipate to spend more than $3.2 billion in the state of New York.
Thank you, Adrienne. Those are not numbers that are lost on anyone. I don't think they certainly are impactful, and selfishly, as economic developers and folks who are looking to see the impact of these kinds of projects on regions, host regions, whether it's for the manufacturing or the actual host of a facility or infrastructure, that's a powerful tool and motivator, but also a powerful incentive for companies to look carefully at what's available in that supply chain and what can be developed over time. Yeah. That's where the relationships that CEG as a regional economic development group developed with Ørsted, developed with Eversource, developed certainly with you and your colleagues at NYSERDA over time, we can really help to extend that reach and identify those current or potential partners who could participate in these types of projects and grow or pivot their businesses entirely based on those levels of opportunities, and the excitement that comes from it not being a single opportunity, but one that's sustained over a 15 or 20 year period. That's the kind of stuff that's transformational as industries and investments come. And we're talking obviously with Ørsted and with other companies who recognize that and have seen it happen in other markets where they've already established their presence. So very encouraging, I think, from that standpoint.
And maybe just to jump in along that point from the developer perspective, we certainly have the requirements that are put into the contract, and happy to have those, but it's also in our long-term best interest to see that development happen here locally. And so we really look forward to the opportunity, as Grant said in his presentation, to folks going to those links that are at the end of the slide and registering, or at the supplier organizations Adrienne mentioned as well. Because we really want to have our supply chain locally. You saw my slide where we were talking about 4,000 megawatts of opportunity here that we're trying to develop. That's many years of construction activities out towards 2030 or beyond that it'll take to fill that. And we need to see that supply chain to come here so that we can start to bring the cost of those projects down over time.
That's right. That's right. We may not be there for the very first project, as you folks pointed out, but there is certainly a significant amount that's available right out of the gate, and more to come. And Grant, you alluded to that, you and Jennifer alluded to that as you were looking at how do you consider manufacturing of some of these key components with your leading suppliers down the road. And those are conversations, obviously, that are underway as well, I'm sure, up and down the East Coast. Mm-hmm. Andrea, Peter, do we have other questions? We probably have time for perhaps one or two more. It's just about 10 minutes of 3. We know we want to wrap up at 3 and let folks get on with the remainder of their day. Other questions that might have come in?
A couple others, quickly, just related to that NYSERDA supply chain registry. If someone is registered on that registry and hasn't received a call, how come? What does that mean?
Sure. No, that's a great question, and happy to take it. So the basis of the registry is to make sure that you you put your best foot forward, right? And that you are visible to the industry. Certainly it is not the only tool in your toolkit as far as business development is concerned, and participating in a webinar exactly such as today is a prime example of what can be done above and beyond just registering. The developers, again, based upon the supplier opportunity provision in our contracts, do have an obligation to consult with the database to ensure that they have looked through it very carefully, and that any opportunity or scope that is in your prospective wheelhouse, that you are solicited as part of that process. But it is an evolving, certainly an evolving registry. We welcome feedback on how we can improve it in order to make sure that it adequately articulates, what skills and opportunities that you and your company, have to offer. So open door, please, for inputs. But in addition, certainly you can register with Ørsted directly and Eversource directly. As Grant indicated, certainly you can likewise be reaching out to the Empire Wind Project in order to make sure that you're knocking on the doors. And we look forward in future to getting back into the field and having in-person events where you can meet and greet, and that's an important function that we're all sorely missing at this point in time. But just encourage you to certainly to avail yourself of all of those opportunities. I don't know that that if you haven't been contacted, it means that you're not qualified or of interest to the community. It may very well, the offshore wind community, that is, it may just very well be that that has not yet come up in terms of their scope of supply or specific needs. And so again, these processes are only sort of kicking off now, and the scopes of supply are starting to roll out steadily over the next couple of years.
May I add to that as well? I would have to say both Ørsted and Eversource, the procurement teams within both of our companies that I know and work with, are utilizing those lists. The NYSERDA list specifically, I have a copy of that on my computer. Last I checked, there were just over 620 companies registered in New York. And I have been contacting some of those folks, as have our procurement teams. As of now, it's primarily based on need. So while we're in this development phase of the project, we have need for certain materials and services. And for many of those, it's logical to come from New York and buy locally, and we're contacting those. For some of the other items that we may not need just yet, but we'll be needing in the future, you probably wouldn't have received a phone call just yet, but when the time comes, we will be relying on those lists.
Great, and a question that's come in for Grant and Adrienne pertains to that. It's asking, how will in-state purchase of goods be evaluated to contribute to economic benefit? And then must the products be made in New York State, or could they also be sold and then purchased in New York State and count?
That's a great question. So just for folks' awareness broadly, the contracts that NYSERDA has with the Sunrise Wind Project and the Empire Wind Project are public. You can actually go and check our contracts. They are part of the Public Service Commission's docket, and likewise they are available as part of Phase 1 report on NYSERDA's website. So if you find yourself on our 2018 solicitation page, you should find yourself some links to that report that walks through the entire process of our procurement, but also again has the actual contracts themselves stapled to it. So I'd encourage you to avail yourself of the specific language. I don't have the contract immediately in front of me, but the gist of it is that we conduct an audit at the end of the project's commissioning. 3 years after the project has been completed, we go through a verification process, and it is literally an audit of the expenditures. And so when the project is bid into the solicitation, and we make the evaluation of what constitutes 20%, that becomes that those dollars become ultimately a target that the project is obligated to reach, and that provision has clause in terms of the any amounts that are not spent within the state then need to be paid for in full to the state. So the project is accountable for every dollar that is claimed as an expenditure as part of the bid process, and that is verified through the evaluation 3 years after the project is concluded. And I would say that in terms of the specifics of transformative work versus sort of buying and selling locally, there are very specific phrases again in that contract that speak to what constitutes a meaningful place of business, what constitutes in-state workplace activities and contributions. So I would just encourage you to look to the contract itself in order to find the specific paragraph that really articulates what constitutes New York state content and how is it counted. I don't know, Grant, if you had anything to.
No, perfect answer. Thanks, Adrienne.
Sure.
Peter, Peter and Andrea, I think maybe we have time for one more question and then we can wrap things up if we have one.
Yep, we just had one come in for Adrienne, and the attendee is asking, will prevailing wages be instituted in the manufacturing of all components? So I assume that means the primary components as well as the secondary components that Grant highlighted in his presentation.
So again, we can look to the contracts for the specific language, but it pertains to all onshore and offshore activities, related to the projects generally.
Okay. With that, I guess before we wrap up, any final comments from any of our presenters? It's been very informative and insightful in my estimation. Hopefully our participants felt as well. Any final comments, folks?
Just sincere thanks to CEG for the opportunity to join this afternoon's conversation, and standing offer if you have any further questions or follow up. I look forward to hearing from you. So thank you.
Terrific.
I would second that. Thank you to the Center for Economic Growth, and also thank you for the support of the industry. The folks at Ørsted and Eversource have been relying on you as a resource to identify companies and capabilities in the region, and we greatly appreciate that.
I'll third that. How about you, Sam? Would you like to fourth that?
Everybody's covered everything, but thank you, appreciate it.
Well, we very much appreciate it. We want to thank, obviously, our friends from Ørsted and Eversource, Sam, Jennifer, and Grant. Clearly, our good friend Adrienne and the team at NYSERDA, who's been leading the way and leading the charge for New York. I want to take a second to thank my colleagues Peter Lyon and Andrea Swank, who you heard from just a few moments ago, and Christina Valentin as well at CEG for helping us to put this webinar on together. Obviously, you've seen notes to and connections available for all of today's presenters as well as CEG. I think we're all here to help this industry to grow, certainly, and grow here in New York State. That's our primary interest, and we're prepared to help and work with you. So please reach out at any point, and we're happy to work with you. Thank you all again, and have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it.